All right, we're going to look at another example based on the same premise that Jerry has 10,000 hours to produce two goods, coffee and cars, and it takes him 10 hours to produce a coffee and 50 hours to produce a car. And George has 10,000 hours to produce two goods, coffee and cars, but it takes him 20 hours to produce coffee and 50 hours to produce one car. From that, we derive the following PPF, and that's an example that was shown previously of how we do this. So here's the PPF of Jerry, and here's the PPF of George. And now we want to ask, when will these individuals engage in trade? Well, let's look at a scenario. Let's look at scenario 1. Jerry sends 500 cups of coffee to George, and in return, George will send Jerry 50 cars. Will they make this trade? Well, let's look first to see what happens. So here we have Jerry sending George 50 cups of coffee. So Jerry's going to go from 1,000, and he's going to drop all the way down to 500. That's how many he's going to export. Well, how many is he going to receive in return? Well, he's going to receive 50 cars. And the question is, where does 50 fall? Is 50 out here? Is 50 on the PPF, or is it inside? It's kind of hard because we haven't really drawn this to scale, or it may not be drawn to scale. And so the question is, can we look at this? Well, let's rewrite Jerry's PPF in terms of an equation. So remember, Jerry's PPF is that coffee equals -5 cars plus 1,000. So let's suppose that indeed Jerry's going to end up with 50 cars from George. So he's going to go from 0 all the way out to 50. And the question is, well, where does that fall in the PPF? So if I put 50 in for cars, I get 5 times -5 times 50, which is 250, minus or plus 1,000. So I'll get equals -250 plus 1,000. Well, that's 750. So the point on the PPF is going to be way up here. Here's 750. So if we look at the scenario 1, where Jerry sends 50 cups of coffee and George sends 50 cars, well, that would be at this point here. And Jerry says, well, I can actually do better than that on my own. I can produce 50 cars and still produce 750 coffee. Whereas if I send George 500 cups of coffee, I go from 1,000 down to 500, and I'll only get 50 cars in return. And so this example, Jerry says no, and he would not want to make this trade. Let's look at scenario 2. Scenario 2 says Jerry sends 100 cups of coffee to George, and George sends Jerry 100 cars in return. Sounds good. So let's see what Jerry's going to do. Okay, so I'm going to try to erase these lines real quick. Okay, so let's see what would happen. So if George is going to send Jerry 100 cars, we want to ask, well, what's that point here? So if he gets 100 cars, what's that point on Jerry's PPF? So I put 100 here in for cars. -5 times 100 is -500, plus 1,000 would be 500. So on his own, that's why I erased this, because it's not necessarily drawn to scale. But on his own, if Jerry would produce 500 cars, he could also produce, or 500 cups of coffee, he could also produce 100 cars. But in this example, George is going to send him 100, so he's going to get 100, but he only has to send George 100 cars in return. So Jerry won't have 500, but instead he'll only have to send 100, so he'll actually have 900 cars. The point he's going to be at is well above the PPF. Jerry says, great day, I accept. Now the question is, would George accept this deal? So we're going to come to George's PPF, and George is completely specializing over here at this point where he has a comparative advantage of 200 cars. So George is going to send 100 cars, so he's going to lose 100 cars. And he's going to get 100 cups of coffee in return. Well, the question is, well, what could George do on his own? If he weren't to trade, he can at least get to that point. So let's write out George's PPF equation. So for him, coffee is equal to negative 2.5 times cars plus 500. So in this case, George will have 100 cars. And so he could produce on his own 250 cups of coffee. Well, what's the deal with Jerry? The deal with Jerry is George has to send 100 cars over to him, and in return, Jerry's only going to send 100 cars. So this is the point that George ends up at, which is below his PPF. So George would say to scenario 2, no deal, even though Jerry really likes that deal because he would exceed his PPF. So there are two scenarios where trade wouldn't happen. Well, let's actually be positive here and let's see where trade might actually happen. So here's an example. Scenario 3. Let's suppose Jerry sends 200 cups of coffee to George, and in return, George sends 50 cars to Jerry. All right, so here we're going to look at this. So Jerry sends 200 cups of coffee. So let's erase some of these points that we had just before. Okay, now we're starting from scratch. So Jerry's going to send 200 cups of coffee. So he's starting at 1,000, and he's going to go down to 800. And those are the 200 cups of coffee he's going to send over to George. George in return is going to send 50 cars. So he's going to start at 200 and come down to the point of 150. Okay, so that's how much George is exporting, and here's how much Jerry's exporting. Okay, so well, if Jerry's now going to get 50 cars from George, we already found that point. That point is right here that we erased, and that's 750. I find that by putting 50 here in for cars, and I get negative 250 plus 1,000 is 750. But in this case, Jerry actually only has to send George 200 cars, so Jerry is going to be above his PPF because he's going to receive 50 cars from George, but only have to give up 200 cups of coffee. So Jerry likes this deal. Well, let's see if George likes this deal. So George is going to receive have at the end 150 cars. So let's put 150 in for here. So we have negative 2.5 times 150, and that's 375. So it's negative 375 plus 500. And so this point right here, for George, if he were to do this on his own, he could have 125 cups of coffee. But in return, Jerry's going to send him 200 cups of coffee. So in fact, George is also going to be able to exceed his PPF. And so in this case, this is the deal that would be accepted. And the question is, well, what's the trade there? Well, the trade there is 200 coffee for every 50 car. Okay, so what's 200 divided by 50? Is 4. So the trade cost is 4. Let's look at scenario 2. We rejected scenario 2. And there the trade cost is 100 coffee for 1 car was 1. Let's look at scenario 1. So, trying to lay these out so we can see them all. scenario 1 was rejected, and there the trade cost is 500 to 50 was 10. So why is it that the trade cost at 4 was accepted while 1 and 10 was not? Well, this has to do with the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost for Jerry was 5. To produce a car, it cost him 5 cups of coffee. For George, the opportunity cost was 2.5. So for every car, he'd have to give up 2.5 cups of coffee. So any trade between the numbers of 2.5 and 5 makes both individuals better off. If the trade were below 2.5, as the example with 1, George would not be better off. If the trade were above 5, as the case of scenario 1 of 10, Jerry would be better off. And so it's only this scenario 3 where the trade cost is 4, or the price of the trade is 4 coffee for every 1 car, that falls between the opportunity cost where both individuals gain from trade.